Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining here. We greatly appreciate your time. You are tuned in for a treat as we go over a history of Black-owned businesses in Detroit. Our speaker today is a man of extensive knowledge and background, Mr. Michael Imhotep. He is the founder of the African History Network and the host of the African History Network show on 910 AM Detroit. The show focuses on educating, empowering, and inspiring African Americans across the world. He is the former nationally syndicated host of the Michael Imhotep show on the Empowerment Radio Network. He is a television talk show host. He is a researcher. He is a lecturer, a writer, a historian. He's also one of the guest hosts on the national radio shows, the Warren Valentine Show and the Roland Martin Show. Lifelong Detroiter, lifelong Detroiter, graduate of Cass Technical High School. And he also holds a degree in business administration science, a bachelor's of science degree in business administration from Wayne State University. This gentleman here lives by the motto that with the right knowledge, you can correct wrong behavior. So please, if you want to put some digital claps in the chat, give it up for my man, Mr. Michael Imhotep.
All right, thanks, Nicholas. I appreciate that. Okay, so I have a presentation here. When Lawrence Jackson contacted me to talk about this, he said he wanted me to talk some about the history of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley African-American businesses in the community of Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, but then also deal with African-American entrepreneurship in general, but more specifically deal with how do we recreate those communities again? How do we recreate those business districts again? Things like this, okay? So I have a PowerPoint presentation here. So this here. All right, so the name of this, so after I finish this presentation, usually I come up with a name before I finish the presentation. I didn't come up with the name till I actually finished this presentation, okay? So I said, well, what should we call it? So since it's about Black Bottom, I said, we're gonna call this, we started at the bottom, now we're here. So we're trying to figure out how to get back what we had. We started at the bottom, now we're here. Black Bottom and Paradise Valley history to create our future, okay? And this is part of Celebrating Black History Month, preparing Black-owned businesses, a virtual conference for success. All right, so my contact information, you call me 313-462-0003. And you can visit my website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. So I'm the host of the African History Network show on 910 AM Superstation WFDF. I'm on 6 days a week, Monday through Friday, 11 p.m. to midnight, and Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, anytime I speak, I know I may say some things that go outside the circumference of some people's awareness. So just because you never heard it before, disagree with it, or don't like it, does not necessarily mean it's not true. Just means you may have to do some research to understand what I'm talking about. I may be talking about something outside the circumference of someone's awareness, okay? All right, so if we jump right into this, a lot of times people may ask the question, what was the Black Bottom neighborhood? What was the Black Bottom community, all right? And many times Black Bottom and Paradise Valley get conflated. These were two different communities. They were close to each other, they were adjacent to each other, but they were not exactly the same community. So in this presentation, we're going to talk some about the history of Black Bottom, Paradise Valley. We'll deal with the Great Migration as well. Great Migration of African Americans migrated from the South up north and out west from 1915 to 1970, and the impact it's had on Detroit. We'll also deal with some of the history of cooperative economics, the co-ops. Okay, because when we study our history, even going back during slavery, but during Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow era, when we look at the businesses we created, many of those came out of various types of co-ops. So we'll talk some about the history of co-ops as well. And then because this is African American History Month, I'm going to talk a little bit about Dr. Carter G. Woodson at the end and the origins of Negro History Week, which started the week of February 7th, 1926, the second week in February, okay, which became Black History Month. Okay, so what was the Black Bottom neighborhood? So Black Bottom was a predominantly African-American neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan, demolished for redevelopment in the late 1950s to early 1960s and replaced with the Lafayette Park residential district and a freeway. So I live in the Lafayette Park area. So I live in what used to be Black Bottom. It was located on Detroit's near east side, bounded by Gratiot Avenue, Brush Street, and the Detroit River and the Grand Trunk Railroad tracks. The Detroit Historical Society, DetroitHistoricalSociety.org, has some good information. They have an encyclopedia of Detroit. So they have some good information on this. There was a good article from a Detroit Free Press as well, bringing Detroit's Black Bottom back to virtual life. And I've been studying some of the history of Detroit for years and have done various presentations. But when we look at even going back to 1908 and Henry Ford with the Ford Motor Company in Highland Park, Michigan, we see African Americans migrating to Detroit even before the Great Migration really starts in 1915. But in 1910, this Detroit City's African-American population was about 5,700. It was less than 6,000. It's about 5,700. And it was 1.2% of Detroit's overall population. But by 1950, there were 300,000 African-American residents in Detroit, or 16% of the 1.8 million Detroiters. And we know Detroit's population basically peaked at about 1.8 million in 1950. So there were about 350 to 360 African-American owned businesses that were located in Black Bottom and the Paradise Valley area. Black Bottom was largely a residential area south of Gratiot Avenue and bounded by Brush Street on the west and the Grand Trunk Railroad tracks on the east. Now, an adjacent area that extended north of Gratiot was known as Paradise Valley. And Paradise Valley was considered a different, though overlapping neighborhood where most businesses and entertainment venues were located. Historically, the area of Black Bottom was part of the riverbed of the River Savoyard, which was buried as a sewer in 1827. And Black Bottom gets its name from the rich marsh soil of its bottom. This is where the name Black Bottom comes from. Now, Hastings Street ran north-south through Black Bottom and had been a center of Eastern European Jewish settlement where before well before World War I. So World War I is 1914 and 1918. U.S. gets involved in World War I in 1917, okay? And we know that because of World War I, this is really going to catapult the Great Migration. You're going to have about 5 million men, largely white men, from the U.S. going to fight in World War I. And this is going to create a labor vacuum in the North, in the factories in the North, things like this. So you have a lot of these companies, a lot of these factories who are going to market to African Americans in the South, living on farms. They could be sharecroppers, et cetera, marketing to them to come up north for a better way of life. Okay, in 1910, about 90% of African Americans lived in the South. Okay, and this was a legacy of slavery. Okay, so Hastings Street, which ran north-south through Black Bottom, had been the center of Eastern European Jewish settlement well before World War I, with housing that was built in the late 19th century, early 20th centuries. As the population began changing from immigrant to migrant, as the population began changing from immigrants immigrating to this country to migrants, especially African Americans migrated from the South up north, the wooden frame houses built side by side, some with indoor plumbing, became packed with African Americans from the South. and they came to work in the auto factories also. Okay. And what you're going to see is, as time goes on, you're going to see overcrowding. You're going to see competition for housing. You're going to see new housing that has to be built, like Brewster Projects and Sojourner Truth Homes, things like this. But also in 1945, when President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 8802, which desegregates the jobs in the Department of Defense, because A. Philip Randolph threatened to put 100,000 African Americans marching on Washington to embarrass Roosevelt if he didn't desegregate jobs in the Department of Defense. Now, this is in June of 1941, I should say 41, not 45, June 1941, before the U.S. actually gets involved in fighting in World War II. The U.S. was already involved in what's known as the Arsenal of Democracy, where we were building military equipment, okay, for the war. But because of the desegregation of the jobs in the Department of Defense, this is going to cause even more African Americans to move up north. They come into Detroit, and they're going to need housing also. Okay, so the restrictive housing covenants prohibited African Americans from living in most other parts of the city. So the Black Bottom area is going to be one of the areas that we're pushed into. And we're going to have segregation, even though we may not have had colored only signs or white only signs. There was definitely segregation in Detroit at that time. Now, what was Paradise Valley? Okay, what was Paradise Valley? So Paradise Valley was the business district and entertainment center of a densely populated African-American residential area in Detroit known as Black Bottom from the 1920s through the 1950s. During the 1920s, the African-American population in Detroit swelled from 41,000 to 120,000 to at about 1930s, 120,000. As migrants from the South arrived daily to seek employment in the automobile industry. Now, what do we have in Paradise Valley? Okay, the cramped Near East Side neighborhood of Black Bottom was one of the very few areas that allowed African Americans to reside. So the residents' daily needs were amply met by more than 300 Black-owned businesses in Paradise Valley. And between the two, you had about 350 businesses or so between Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. These businesses range from drugstores, beauty salons, and restaurants to places of leisure, such as nightclubs, bowling alleys with bars, theaters, mini golf courses, things like this. You're going to have the Gotham Hotel. You're going to have the Paradise Valley Theater. So these are legendary places. I'm going to give you, at the end of the presentation, I'll give you some resources to read also for more information as well. I'll give you some books to read for more information. Now, the nightclubs and theaters in Paradise Valley were a primary source of income for the residents of the impoverished neighborhood. African-American owned nightclubs like the Flame Show Bar, the Horseshoe Bar, and Club Harlem booked popular African-American artists and attracted mixed race audiences to these shows. Now, white people felt comfortable listening to jazz alongside Black audiences and ventured to the Valley, to venture to Paradise Valley to hear Ethel Waters, Pearl Bailey, Ella Fitzgerald, and the Ink Spots. Okay, all the top African-American performers basically performed at Paradise Valley, performed in Paradise Valley and the Paradise Valley Theater. The Paradise Theater opened in 1941 in the former Orchestra Hall and was the place to hear jazz greats such as Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, and Dizzy Gillespie. After the race riots in 1943, now this is during World War II, and the huge, people talk about the rebellion in 1967. You had a huge race riot in 1943 up and down Woodward Avenue, okay? And after the 1943 race riot, whites became reluctant to visit Paradise Valley and mixed audiences became rare. Now here's a picture of outside of the Paradise Theater also. And they were having Duke Ellington, who's going to perform there, Duke Ellington and his orchestra. Now, gambling was also big business in Paradise Valley, notably with the Great Lakes Mutual Numbers House and the Valley's Fraud Club. So we know, like, you study the history, like you watch movies like Hoodlum, or you study Bumpy Johnson and things like this. You had organized crime that was into the numbers. This is before it gets taken over by the state lottery. Okay, and you have African Americans that control the numbers in different cities, and then you're going to have white groups that do it as well, and then we're largely going to get knocked out of a lot of that because the numbers get turned into the state lottery. Okay, kind of like how, you know, it's it's like with legalized marijuana, like a lot of us get locked out of that and can't get marijuana dispensaries, you know. So, but gambling was also big business in Paradise Valley, notably with the Great Lakes Mutual Numbers House. Now, in 1939, a scandal involving gamblers from Paradise Valley, Detroit police officers, and the mayor's office resulted in those involved being jailed on charges of gambling and accepting bribes. In 1963, the FBI raided the lavish Gotham Hotel, which was African-American owned, okay? They raided the lavish Gotham Hotel. And so the FBI raised the Gotham Hotel, and it was home to many jazz artists who were visiting Paradise Valley and performing there. They raided it on evidence of illegal gambling. All right, now urban renewal programs, and we're going to see this concept first start with Mayor Edward Jeffries in 1944, but then because of the Federal Housing Act of 1949, and then the U.S. Interstate Highway Acts in 1952 and 56, we're going to see what many white people call urban renewal, or what we call Negro removal. We're going to see this run about 41,000 miles of U.S. interstate highways all across the country. And it runs through about 1,600 African-American communities. This is at a time when you're having the suburbs being built as well. Okay, so this deals with post-World War II and understanding what happened after World War II, the baby boomer generation, these men coming back home from the war, their families expanding, and then these new suburbs being built, these new developments being built in the suburbs. And because of things like redlining, discrimination, we can't move out to the suburbs and we get locked in the inner cities. Then you have the deindustrialization of the inner cities as well. Okay, so all this is taking place at the same time. The urban renewal, expressways running through our communities, the suburbs being built, all this is taking place at the same time. Then you have the modern day civil rights movement, 1955, 56, 57, et cetera, through the 60s. Now, urban renewal programs and the construction of freeways in the 1960s abruptly halted life in Paradise Valley and the Black Bottom neighborhood. Automobile factorers outgrew city factories and relocated to suburban areas, necessitating the construction of expressways, okay? And then they're building these expressways to go from the suburbs down to the downtown business district. And they're running right through our communities, wiping our homes, our land being taken, homes that we own, oftentimes being taken through eminent domain. All this is taking place, but this is taking place across the country. It's not just Detroit. Consequently, in 1959, destruction of Paradise Valley began to make way for the I-375 portion of the Chrysler Freeway. Today, Lafayette Park is on the former site of Black Bottom. A portion of Paradise Valley is now Ford Field, okay? And Paradise Theater, the jazz mecca of the 1940s and 50s, has been restored to its 1919 original condition and is once again Orchestra Hall and home to the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. So when you go and look at different cities, like if you go look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? A lot of the land that African Americans owned in Tulsa is now owned either by the state of Tulsa, either the state of Oklahoma, or it's owned by the city. And the expressways ran through Tulsa, Oklahoma, through the Greenwood district where Black Wall Street was. They ran through there in the 1970s and wiped out what was left of the businesses. Now, many neighborhoods in Detroit were displaced by the building of freeways and the projects of urban renewal, but Paradise Valley suffered the largest losses. Although it was difficult for displaced African Americans to find new housing, many purchased property in the old Jewish neighborhood along 12th Street. Many of the former residents kept pictures of the old neighborhood, and these have helped keep the memory alive of the once vibrant Paradise Valley community. Now, Detroit Historical Society, DetroitHistoricalSociety.org, they have a good piece on Paradise Valley also that you can check out called Paradise Valley. Now, so what happens is a lot of African Americans who got displaced from Black Bottom, they moved into the 12th and Claremont area. So when the rebellion jumps off, July 23rd, 1967, a lot of them were already angry because they already got displaced from their homes. So you're going to see this, you're going to see a snowball effect, okay? 67 rebellion didn't just fall out the sky, no. All right, now, if we look at the Gotham Hotel, okay, this is an interesting history here. So blackpast.org, which is, I teach online classes and I do lectures, I teach online history classes, so I'll give you some information at the end on the online history classes I teach on Saturdays and Sundays. But blackpast.org has about 6,000 pages of African history and African American history. So they have a good article here on the Gotham Hotel, okay? And it was owned by John White and Irving Rowan, okay, two African-American men. It existed from basically 1943 to 1963. So what was the Gotham Hotel? The Gotham Hotel in Detroit, Michigan was an example of the intersection between legitimate business and illicit enterprise in the Jim Crow era. Okay, now this is, I don't want to say this is the American way, but I mean, this is like, you're going to see a lot of, when you look at the bootleggers, you look at the Prohibition era, things like this, you're going to see a lot of people getting to Prohibition, illegal alcohol, things like this. You'll see different immigrant groups. You'll see the Italians and et cetera. And this helps give rise to the Italian mafia. And then they're also then going to buy into legitimate businesses, et cetera, things like this. So we're going to see this happen when you talk about the numbers, whether you talk about the booze joints, the illegal watering holes. I mean, we see this happen throughout history. Now, the Gotham Hotel was originally founded to provide a social and business center for local African-American professionals and a place of accommodation for visiting dignitaries who were unwelcome in downtown hotels. In November 1943, the Gotham Hotel's founder and first owners, John White and Irving Rowan, two local African-American entrepreneurs, teamed up to purchase the 9-story hotel at the corner of John R. Street and Orchestra Place from Albert Hartz, a Danish businessman. And one of the things you're going to, when you study this history about Detroit, you're going to see the different ethnic groups here, different immigrants, things like this. And it was said that in Henry Ford's plant, in Highland Park, Michigan, Henry Ford's plant, at one time, there was like 90 different languages spoken in the plant because you had so many immigrants that were coming to this country. Now, for the next 2 decades, the Gotham Hotel hosted visiting African-American dignitaries and celebrities from around the world, simultaneously providing African-American Detroiters with a clean, comfortable facility for staging dinners, as well as public and private social events. During the first decade, the Gotham Hotel boasted that it provided accommodations for many of the most prominent African Americans in business, sports, and entertainment. Its guest list included Jesse Owens, Jackie Robinson, Joe Louis, who we know was from Detroit, the Brown bomber, B.B. King, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Count Basie, Langston Hughes, Sammy Davis Jr., Billie Holiday. These were all regular guests. Okay. Now, many businessmen in African-American urban economy, like many businessmen, John White was also a gambler who played the numbers. And by the 1950s, when hotel revenues were declining, John White reserved the top floor penthouse of the hotel for gambling. Prominent white and Black politicians, as well as Detroit police detectives, frequented the hotel during this period and presumably knew about the hotel's reputation as a place for gambling. Nonetheless, the police looked the other way. The FBI, many of the police looked the other way. The FBI and Detroit Police Commissioner George Edwards, however, were determined to end the hotel's illegal activities. So losing money from its legitimate enterprise, providing accommodations for visitors and facilities for local groups, the Gotham Hotel officially closed for business in September 1962. 4 months later, in December 1962, over 100 federal agents, state troopers, and the Detroit police officers raided a gambling den in the vacant hotel and arrested 42 people, including the owner, John White. At the time, this was the largest gambling raid in Detroit's history. So police claimed that the hotel was the center of a gambling operation that netted as much as $30 million a year. Okay, so you're talking about 1960s. Okay, 63, 64, $30 million a year. 2 years later, in July 1964, the Gotham Hotel was demolished, ostensibly to create room for quote unquote urban renewal projects such as Lafayette Park, the Chrysler Freeway, and the Elmwood Housing Project to replace old neighborhood housing and modernize transportation in the area. Today, however, the hotel's former location at John R. and Orchestra Place still stands vacant. Okay, so blackpast.org has a good piece there on the Gotham Hotel in Detroit. So when we look at Black Bottom, okay, why was Black Bottom destroyed? All right, now, a friend of mine and fellow historian, Jamon Jordan, and I've interviewed him, I've had him on my show a few times before, and we've been on other shows together as well. Jamon Jordan talked about why Black Bottom was destroyed. In 1944, Detroit Mayor Edward Jeffries and the city council proposed a plan to tear down old structures around the city. Now, quote, it's really a form of urban renewal, which for many African Americans, they call Negro removal, because many times they would be the first group of people whose homes and businesses would be taken. But the city didn't have the funds to carry out that project until the federal government passed the National Housing Act in 1949, or also what's called the Federal Housing Act of 1949, which gave states and cities the money necessary to demolish these old structures. After the passage of the National Housing Act in summer of 1949, within 2 months, they began tearing down the first buildings in Black Bottom. So if we look at the Great Migration, okay, because the Great Migration plays a lot into the history of Detroit, especially the history of African Americans in Detroit. And the Great Migration is going to change this country. So very quickly here, the Great Migration deals with the migration of about 6 million African Americans migrating from the South up north and out west. It's roughly from about 1915 to 1970. Some sources will started in 1916, okay? And it really explodes because of World War I and the labor vacuum that is created when about 5 million men go fight, largely white men go fight in World War I. Now, the Great Migration was the relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South to the cities of the North, Midwest, and West from about 1916, 1915 to 1970. Driven from their homes by unsatisfactory economic opportunities and harsh segregationist laws, many African Americans headed north, where they took advantage of the need for industrial workers that first arose during the First World War. During the Great Migration, African Americans began to build a new place for themselves in public life, actively confronting racial prejudice as well as economic, political, and social challenges to create a Black urban culture that would exert enormous influence in the decades to come. Now, by the end of 1919, in 1919 is the Red Summer, okay? So how many of you are familiar with the Red Summer? You can, I don't know if I'll be able to see you all, but let me see. Okay, we'll do it like that. How many of you are familiar with the Red Summer 1919? We have over 25 major race riots in this country. And this is after World War I ends. And this is also during basically the Spanish flu pandemic, the Great Pandemic, 1918, 1919, 1920. There was a huge race riot in Chicago in like about July of 1919. But by the end of 1919, some 1 million African Americans had left the South, usually traveling by train, boat, or bus. A smaller number had automobiles or even horse-drawn carts. In the decade between 1910 and 1920, the African American population of major northern cities grew by large percentages. In New York City, the population of African Americans grew by 66% from 1910 to 1920. In Chicago, grew by 148%. In Philadelphia, it grew by 500% from 1910 to 1920. In Detroit, it grew by 611%, just from 1910 to 1920. So rising rents, the rising rent prices in segregated areas, plus a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan activity after 1915, worsened African-American and white relations across the country. So the Ku Klux Klan is rejuvenated because of the movie The Birth of a Nation, which debuts February 8th, 1915. And the movie causes race riots in the streets. And this causes a resurgence of the Klan, which had largely died out by 1915, because the Klan was founded December 24th, 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. So a lot of the early members were dead. And is going to be rejuvenated by a man named Reverend William Joseph Simmons. Reverend William Joseph Simmons, who sees the movie and he sees the movie The Birth of a Nation, which shows the Ku Klux Klan as being the heroes of the movie. And he starts a newer version of the Klan in October of 1915. Okay, the Reverend William Joseph Simmons. The Washington Post has a really good article on him and how he revived the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the summer of 1919 began the greatest period of interracial strife in U.S. history at that time, including a disturbing wave of race riots known as the Red Summer. So it was James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP who coined the term the Red Summer, because he said the streets of America were flowing with blood. Okay, he was also the man who organized the Silent March of 1917. We had about 10,000 African Americans marching down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, demanding federal anti-lynching laws. Okay, and a lot of that was inspired by the East St. Louis race riot of 1917. That's James Weldon Johnson. James Weldon Johnson also wrote the lyrics for Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is the Black national anthem. And his brother Rosamond Johnson wrote the melody. Now, Black migration slowed considerably in the 1930s because of the Great Depression, but picked up after the coming of World War II. By 1970, when the Great Migration ended, its demographic impact was unmistakable. Whereas in 1900, 9 out of every 10 African Americans lived in the South. 90% of the African American population lived in the South in 1900. And 3 out of every 4 African Americans lived on farms in 1900. By 1970, the South was home to less than half of the country's African-American population, with only 25% living in the region's rural areas. Okay, so blackpast.org has some good information on the Great Migration, but also history.com, which is the official website of the History Channel. They have some good information there as well. Okay, now let me see this here just a second. Okay, so very quickly here, what led to Detroit's downfall? Then we're going to talk about the cooperatives in the history of African-American cooperative economics. What led to Detroit's downfall? So by August of 1967, Detroit had lost over 300,000 residents and over 140,000 manufacturing jobs. So just so people know, this is before Mayor Young became mayor. He didn't take the oath of office to January 1st, 1974, just for people who don't know this history, okay? This is before Mayor Young. Now, and this is leading up to the Detroit Rebellion also. All this stuff is going, you had a declining population before the Detroit Rebellion took place. Now, the population of Detroit quintuples and increases 5 times by 1900 to 1930. 1930 to 1950, nearly 200,000 African Americans moved to Detroit. Detroit had immigrants coming from all over the world to work in the auto plants: Lithuanians, Hungarians, Jews, Scots, Irish, Mexicans, Canadians, Lebanese, etc. Now you have President Roosevelt in the arsenal of democracy, where this is before the U.S. gets involved in actually fighting in World War I, but the U.S. is making military equipment, B-24 Liberator bombers, M5 tanks, and the Guardian building in downtown Detroit was a headquarters of this. It was a headquarters of this manufacturing, and you're going to have the big three that are going to start making this equipment as well, this military equipment, and the big three have government contracts to make this military equipment. 1942 to 1945, wartime production of military equipment takes place in Detroit. Racial tensions are going to increase in Detroit, 1945, 1965. Detroit race riot, 1943. 1950s, I-375 and I-75 comes through Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, 1950s and into the 1960s. So between 1947 and 1948, the big three build 25 new factories. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler build 25 new factories. None of them are in Detroit. And one of the things when you research this, and there's a really good article that I read back in 2013 by Marilyn Katz for InTheseTimes.com. It was originally called Detroit's Downfall, and they changed the name of it. I'm not sure why they changed the name of it, but I have like the original article that I printed up, because originally it was called Fall Beyond the Myth of Black Misleadership. That's the original title. Now they changed the title because, see, this is, I have what the original title was. And because what it does is, this article shows how when Mayor Young took over Detroit, Detroit was already on life support. Detroit had its first budget deficit in 1961. It talks about how screwed up Detroit was when Mayor Young took over. Okay, I know they like to blame us for it. No, so that may be why they had to change the name, because originally it was called Detroit's Downfall Beyond the Myth of Black Misleadership, and it talked about what happened before Mayor Young took over. But anyway, so in less than 2 decades, Detroit lost 128,000 auto industry jobs from 1947 to 1967. Then in 1949, the U.S. Congress passed the Federal Housing Act of 1949, which gave low interest loans with only 3% down to buy homes in the suburbs. But when we tried to take advantage of that, we got discriminated against because of redlining, things like this. We got discriminated against. And even with the GI Bill, you had like 1.2 million African-American World War II veterans. And when we tried to take full advantage of the GI Bill and take advantage of the low interest loans to buy houses and things like this, we face discrimination also. But read this article here from Marilyn Katz that they changed the title of it. A half century after Detroit uprising, cities still stranded by capitalism and federal government. is a good article, but it was originally called Detroit's Downfall Beyond the Myth of Black Men's Leadership. And it dealt with who screwed Detroit up before Mayor Young became mayor. Now, what are co-ops? Because when we study this history, and when you start researching co-ops, you'll probably come across Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nemhard. I interviewed her back in 2014. She's the author of a fantastic book called Collective Courage, a history of African-American cooperative economic thought and practice. And this deals with a deep, rich history that African-Americans have with cooperatives, with the co-ops, okay? So what are co-ops? Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nemhard in the interview said the Black cooperative movement has always been parallel to the Black liberation and civil rights movement. We've mostly heard about the political side of the movement, but you can't name a major Black political leader that didn't point to cooperatives as a pathway to freedom. Now, the reason why it's really important to study the cooperatives is we had them during slavery, we had them during Reconstruction. Reconstruction is 1865, 1877. We had them during slavery, during Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, civil rights movement. And these are ways that many of our businesses were able to thrive. We were able to work together, we were able to raise money, etc. Okay, so this is why this is so important. And when we talk about Kwanzaa and the Nguzo Saba and the fourth principle of Kwanzaa, Ujamaa is cooperative economics. It's dealing with the co-ops. Now, cooperative economics is not white capitalism in red, black, and green. That's not cooperative economics. The co-ops are something different. Okay, and my degree is in business administration. I learned white capitalism from Wayne State's business school, but you can learn some good things there, but the cooperatives is a different concept. Dr. W.B. Du Bois in 1935 said, there exists today a chance for Blacks to organize a cooperative state within their own group by letting Negro farmers feed Negro artisans and Negro technicians, guide Black home industries and Black thinkers plan this integration of cooperation, while Black artists dramatize and beautify the struggle. Economic independence can be achieved. Economic independence can be achieved. To doubt that this is possible is to doubt the essential humanity and the equality of brains of Black people. Now, Berry Gordy, Motown Records, okay, Hitsville, USA. Berry Gordy got an $800 loan from the Burberry Family Co-op. This is where he got the money to start Motown Records. With it, at the Motown Museum's website, they have this information, this history on Berry Gordy. With an $800 loan in hand from the Gordy family's Burberry Co-op, Berry Gordy set out in 1959 to apply some of the principles he learned in the auto plant to the production of records and the creation of music groups and solo artists. He envisioned a process by which a quote, kid could walk in one door, an unknown off the street, and come out the other, a polished performer, end quote. So we see the concept of co-ops. These are African concepts that we actually brought with us to this country. When we look at West African, West African ethnic groups, West African cultures, and Caribbean cultures, they have something called a susu, S-U-S-U. In parts of West Africa and the Caribbean, an ancient version of cooperative economics exists called susu. As one of the oldest forms of microfinance in Africa, the practice is run by one of Africa's oldest financial groups, susu collectors. They run their businesses from kiosks in the marketplace. They run their business from kiosks in the marketplace and act as mobile bankers, Clients make low but regular deposits on a daily basis over the course of a month into a susu account. At the end of this period, the susu collector returns the accumulated savings to the client, but keeps one day's savings as commission. Susu collectors may also provide advances to their clients or rotate the accumulated deposits of a group between individual members. Today, Susu collectors provide many West Africans who would otherwise be denied credit with access to money they need to start up small venture projects that in many cases benefit the community as a whole. In the United States, Black immigrants from the Caribbean have enjoyed one of the highest economic growth rates using a form of the Susu and leveraging this practice to establish successful credit unions. And now credit unions are one of the most well-known forms of cooperatives, because the people who have accounts in the credit union are known as members, and they're also owners of the credit unions. Okay, a quick example of a co-op that we had, one of the early examples, goes back to the Free African Society of 1787, created by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. In 1787, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, prominent Black ministers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, formed the Free African Society, a mutual aid and religious organization. Okay. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over some of this. We're going to go through this quickly. Colored Merchants Association was a really big one. 1928, the National Negro Business League, which was founded by Booker T. Washington in 1900, the National Negro Business League of Montgomery, Alabama, established the Colored Merchants Association, a cooperative organization of Black grocery stores. Okay, because if you know, the three main businesses we should own, well, a few main businesses we should own grocery stores because we have to eat. Okay, funeral homes because you have to die, life insurance companies, beauty salons, hair salons, and somewhere to buy your clothes. Okay, clothing stores. But one of the biggest businesses we had were grocery stores. Okay, so this was the Colored Merchants Association was a cooperative of Black grocery stores. The purpose of the organization was to reduce the operating costs of Black retailers through mutual support, cooperative buying, and collective marketing in a harsh market dominated by white-owned chain stores. This helped Black-owned grocery stores better compete against the Kresge's and the Woolworths and the white-owned chain stores, the Colored Merchants Association. The CMA model was markedly successful. Associated stores reported increases in businesses and profits. The association spread to nearly 18 cities, including Chicago, Philadelphia, Nashville, Dallas, and New York. The Colored Merchants Association built its national headquarters in New York City in October 1929. Chapters were organized in cities with 10 or more stores. CMA members paid $5 per month per store and were required to meet designated standards. By 1930, 253 stores were part of the Colored Merchants Association. Members received support services from the association, such as intensive training in merchandising techniques, sales training, advertising, and management resources such as market analysis, inventory and bookkeeping systems, and collection and credit procedures. Okay. And then lastly, you have the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union, created in 1886. They grow to 1.2 million members. This was founded in Texas. Okay. And oftentimes we're going to have to disband these cooperatives because our lives are threatened. People are being beaten up because we were dealing with white supremacy and racism, and our economic success was oftentimes being attacked. All right, so I'm gonna, for the sake of time, I know we may have some questions. I'm gonna stop right there and open it up to questions. And then before we leave, I'll give you some information on the online classes that I teach also. Okay, so we have any questions, Nicholas?
Yeah, well, we actually did have one question that I did see in the chat.
Okay.
It says some historical accounts indicate that Black Bottom went as far down as Hastings, as East Milwaukee. Is that consistent with your research?
As East Milwaukee. Now, when you research this, there was no like legal boundary for this, but basically when we look at Black Bottom, it was bounded by Gratiot Avenue, Brush Street, Verner Highway, and the Grand Trunk Railroad tracks. Okay. Now, but there was not necessarily a legal boundary for this. So it made at some point it may have been considered to go further than that, but that's generally the boundaries for it.
Anyone else have a question they want to either place in the chat or go ahead and come off mic and ask at this time?
If not, I'll give a little background information on Black History Month, if you don't have any more questions. Did you all learn anything? Hopefully you learned something.
Oh yeah, I took away a lot of information, man.
Okay.
I thought it was really,
and then,
really wonderful for sure.
Just some books to read. Okay, this one here, Detroit Paradise Valley by Ernest H. Borden. Detroit Paradise Valley by Ernest H. Borden. Okay, it's a really good book. They have a lot of pictures in here and gives the history of Paradise Valley. This one here by Thomas Segru. When I was doing research on the fake bankruptcy of Detroit and all this nonsense, this is a book that I kept seeing talked about, and he was interviewed on MSNBC. The Origins of the Urban Crisis, Race and Inequality in Post-War Detroit by Thomas J. Segru. He's a professor at in Pennsylvania. I think he's a history professor. That one, Collective Courage by Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nimhard also. And then you have it's a book by my friend Ken Coleman. Ken Coleman's book is dealing with he has a book dealing with history of Detroit also. Ken Coleman, just Google Ken Coleman. All right, then very quickly here, let's see, I have a ton of books around me, but those are the books I pulled for this information. When we look quickly here at African American History Month, Black History Month, it was created by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. It started February 7th, the second weekend in February 7th, 1926. Now, Dr. Carter G. Woodson co-founds the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, September 9th, 1915. And he understands that African Americans did not understand their history, did not know their history. He was an educator. He was the first African American to get a PhD in American history from Harvard, second African American get a PhD from Harvard. First was Dr. W.B. Du Bois. But Dr. Woodson founded Negro History Week in 1926. He explained the reason behind the celebration in the pamphlet. And he chose the second week in February because it contained the birth dates of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And we already had celebrations during the second week in February because of those two birthdays African Americans did. Dr. Woodson exclaimed that African Americans knew, quote, practically nothing about their history. He ultimately believed that African Americans could benefit immensely from knowledge of their past and accomplishments of their ancestors. He added that race prejudice was the byproduct of whites' beliefs that Black people had not contributed anything of worth to world civilization. And he said that the history of our people need to be taught in schools all across the country year round. It's not just taught in our schools. He said that everybody needed to understand our history. And when we deal with African American History Month or Black History Month, it also deals with the history throughout the diaspora and on the continent of Africa. There's an annual theme each year. There's been an annual theme for Black History Month going back to 1928. This year's annual theme is Black Health and Wellness. Okay, Black Health and Wellness. Now, Dr. Woodson argued that if the historical record was set straight and that if the history of Black people were studied along with the achievements of others in schools, not only would African-American youth develop a sense of pride and self-worth, but racism would be abolished. So he's saying that our history has to be incorporated into the curriculum in the school as well. When you have a requirement to take the history about one people's history or American history, and then another people's history is not required to be taught, and you have to take this history over here to get a diploma, to get a degree, to be able to go on to the next step. You elevate one people's history, and people are a product of their history. You elevate one people's history and you diminish another people's history. So you tacitly say one group of people are superior and another group of people are inferior. Dr. Woodson said our history has to be taught in schools all across the country, and everybody needs to learn our history. Now, okay, so for the sake of time, let's go to this here. Negro History Week was the first major achievement in popularizing Black history and was unique in that it focused on the Black youth. Dr. Woodson, who was an educator, realized that the miseducation of Black people began in their homes, communities, and elementary schools. Woodson's vision of Negro History Week was optimistic, strategic, and long-term. He wanted this modest week-long celebration to serve as a stepping stone toward the gradual introduction of Black history into the curricula of all levels of the U.S. educational system. He hoped that Negro History Week would evolve into Negro History Year, as he affirmed from time to time. Woodson consistently instructed those observing the week that they needed to diligently prepare for the celebration months in advance. Diligently prepare for the celebration months in advance. See, unfortunately, oftentimes people celebrate Black History Month having studied Woodson and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and we just, we just have the same 15, 20 people each year, figures in history that we deal with. Okay, our history is much more deeper than that. And this is what Dr. Woodson dedicated his life to teaching. He said Negro History Week should be a demonstration of what has been done in the study of the Negro during the year, and at the same time as a demonstration of greater things to be accomplished. This is what he instructed teachers. He said it didn't make sense. He said a subject which receives attention 1 week out of the 36 will not mean much to anyone. Read more Carter G. Woodson in Washington, D.C., The Father of Black History by Dr. Pero Dagbovie.